Hi, I'm back for another episode of the fabulous Basstravaganza. I want to talk about streams and erosion and wood and water and gravel and how they interact here on Vancouver Island. So I'm actually recording today from my portable lounge chair out here in middle of Nanaimo River. It's been a difficult summer for a lot of people in a lot of ways. There's been this nasty virus going around, and now you can see that the air here is not very clean. This smoke you see is blowing up from the western U.S., from burning forests mostly. But it's more personal in my case. I was looking for a quiet place, and I set up my studio here right in the glide path to Nanaimo Airport. Anyway, the smoke here, mostly from burning forests in the U.S., but in my case, more personal because I used to live down in Oregon, and some of this smoke might be coming from the Burger King in Ashland, Oregon, where I used to stop there on the way back from fishing trips. Ashes now. A few of them are probably from Ray's Market in Talent, Oregon, where they had that outdoor barbecue. I used to go there and buy ribs. Ashes now. Some are from the world famous Bear Creek Greenway. Ashes now. Maybe they should change the name to the Bear Creek Blackway, from what I hear. I used to be chair of the Bear Creek Watershed Council. So you can see how it might be more personal for me, and some of this smoke might be from the houses of old friends, and God forbid, some of this smoke might be from the bodies, charred bodies of people I used to sit across the table from at meetings. So let's change that subject and let's go on to talk about rivers. I started writing up the script for this Tale of Two Rivers series years ago. So I've had lots of time to think about this last section. Part 4 is going to be my suggestions about ways that humans could intervene to limit the ruination of some of the finest forests and fish habitat on planet Earth, and how we, the people who live in a watershed or near it, in the case of me and the N2 River, could intervene to change the public mindset from one that favors exploitation and extinction into one that encourages nurturing streams to produce a bounty that can be shared by people and countless other forms of life. In the past episodes, 20 and 21, I tried to describe the history and the evolution of the situation where we find ourselves in here on Van Isle regarding stream habitat. Now I want to talk about the future. I think I already mentioned that as a kid, I read books by a guy from Campbell River named Roderick Haig Brown. And I still reread some of his books today. And I'm amazed at how far he was from the mainstream when it came to his philosophy of rivers, and how far from the mainstream I am as well, but how close we are in our shared beliefs about watersheds. In fact, we're so close that some of the witty little proverbs that I like to drop on people that I thought I had invented were actually just regurgitated from his books that I read so many years ago. How many times have I told people something like, if patience is a fisherman's virtue, I am not and never have been a virtuous fisherman, without realizing that it wasn't me that made it up. It was old Rod that wrote those words 50 years ago. So I want to start this episode with another Haig Brown quote from one of his books I was reading the other day. He was the first one to talk seriously about the concept of rehabilitating streams after they had been damaged by clear-cut logging. He said, I think of this as gardening the rearing streams, and I think we will come to it in the end. I only wish it could be sooner rather than later, because the possibilities seem so sharply exciting. It's from 1957. For thousands of years, the N2 watershed produced huge runs of wild fish. Prior to logging, it was a natural fish factory owned and operated by Mother Nature at no cost to humans. Steelhead, cutthroat trout, dolly varden char, chum, coho, and chinook salmon all thrived in the lake and the river that ran through it. Fishing was so legendary that before the logging road was pushed in, local floatplane companies used to fly customers up there, and they even flew in plywood and 2x4s, and they built a cabin on the lake so they could fly fishermen in to experience that great fishing. Now the top end of N2 Lake and the river just upstream from it is an ongoing environmental train wreck. This disaster isn't just an act of God, it's an act of logging, and it's an act of government policy. For thousands of years, this location was one of the most productive spots on Earth for giant wild salmon and giant steelhead and Sitka spruce and red cedar. Now it's a wasteland of dead trees and rolling gravel where fish struggle to survive. The foreign owners of fish farms around Van Isle spend millions of dollars to promote the optimum conditions for growing fish inside their fish pens. But we, the public, continue to trash our wild fish factories. 30 years after the first big clear cuts here, the salmonid habitat in this location continues to get worse, not better. Over the span of 3 decades, no one at any corporate or government level seems inclined to accept any responsibility for this ongoing demolition of prime wild salmon and old-growth forest habitat. Fisheries scientists, corporate managers, and government bureaucrats often claim that juvenile salmon hatched in BC have poor survival rates when they go to the ocean. The ocean's full of plastic, and there's a huge blob of warm water in the middle of the Pacific, and there's drift nets and sea lions and not enough herring and other bait fish to feed them, etc., etc. The raven. This may be partly or all true. I'm no expert on any of that. But if this is the main cause for the decline of wild BC salmon, I would expect it to apply all across the ocean. It's a tough world out there, and fish stocks are collapsing everywhere, right? But I was surprised, shocked actually, to learn recently that nothing could be further from the truth. According to Dr. Richard Beamish, there are actually more salmon in the North Pacific right now than there may have been at any other time in the history of the Earth. And not only that, global salmon harvests are at the highest point in history. But this record bounty is coming from Russia and from Alaska and from hatcheries in Japan. It's not coming from Vancouver Island. See, I have a critic up there. I have many critics. But onward. So why are wild salmon here on Vancouver Island diminishing to extinction while the total salmon population in the ocean is the highest ever? If the BC declines are due to the factors I mentioned above, why are stocks from wild watersheds in Kamchatka and Alaska not declining too? For me, it's discouraging to watch resource managers, past or present, ignore the ongoing decline in stream habitat here on Van Isle, and even more discouraging to hear them claim that it's a waste of time and money to pay attention to the damage or try to repair and improve crippled streams, especially while people in other places in the world are actually doing it. And especially while our local wild salmon populations are going extinct. And more frustrating for me to listen to that argument when my own personal all-time favorite wild steelhead fishery is getting trashed year after year. And it would be so easy to help it start recovering. If someone had gone into those jams that I documented in Tale of Two Rivers, in the upper N2 River, with a big chainsaw and cut loose a few of the key drift logs, 90% of the big trees that have tipped over since would probably still be standing. And the river might still be flowing there all summer long. Watershed maintenance and restoration is not impossible. Just the opposite. I could have done it myself with a big chainsaw, and I would have been glad to do it, except that it's illegal to do it on your own and it's impossible to get permission. I published one of my Basstravaganza episodes that was about Mushalot Lake. It was called Octwanch, Anatomy of a Murder. In it, I pointed to a spot and I predicted that one more big drift log could plug the entire channel at this spot, and then all hell would break loose. It would have been so easy to buck a couple key drift logs in that jam to allow the river to go down to the lake. This summer I went back and I found that the river did indeed jam at that exact spot. The old main channel, which was maybe 20 meters wide, just blasted out in all directions, and it's now maybe half a kilometer wide from one mouth to the other, and it's just hacking, blasting down acres and acres of second growth trees, huge drifts of gravel, and no more river. Check this out, just an ocean of log jams, far as the eye can see. This is astounding. So I've already spent an hour and a half over 3 episodes going into nauseating detail to document changes in fish habitat in the river just upstream from fabulous N2 Lake, triggered by reckless clear-cut logging. If anyone wants to look at those, you can go to these links. To sum it up briefly, the river that is tributary to N2 Lake was largely clear-cut beginning in the 1980s, except for a fringe around the top of the lake. The logging triggered huge erosion, which sent tremendous loads of gravel and logs and silt and boulders and whole trees rampaging down the river channel during floods. The roots of the giant trees that had locked the channel edges in place washed away as well, so the channel became much, much wider, but also much, much shallower. A lot of the old trees, huge old trees, were washed down until they smashed into the fringe of forest left standing above the lake, where they jammed against the old growth. More driftwood piled up against these snag drift logs plugging the main channel and forcing it out to find a new way to get down to the lake, right through the standing trees. So they undercut more of those standing giant trees, which fall across the new channels and block those channels, so it forces more channels to split out and undercut more trees, and it is a perpetual motion machine of environmental destruction. There is little or no stable spawning area left here. Huge trees continue to get undercut and toppled into the carnage every year. And after more than 30 years, the habitat doesn't seem to be getting better. It keeps getting worse. So what do you notice if you look around here? Gravel. Lots of gravel. And there's some up right here. I don't see any fish in it. There's more. More gravel here. I don't see any fish in that either. That's because fish don't live in gravel. They live in water. If you look over here, you see lots of little fish. They're baby salmon. They're swimming around. That's because there's water there. Fish live in the water there, not in the gravel here. So that's my first basis point that I'm going to start from. Fish live in water, not in gravel. And you know, there are huge salmon swimming right by in the main river right there. There's pink salmon and maybe big Chinooks right now. And but they live in the water, not in the gravel. So what would happen if you took 100,000 dump trucks of gravel and dumped it right on top of this spot? What would happen to the fish? That's what has happened and continues to happen to the wild salmon and trout habitat on Vancouver Island rivers and streams. And that's what's happening at Fabulous N2 River above Fabulous N2 Lake. So what exactly is a river? It's that tiny fraction of a watershed at the very bottom of the valley where the water table is above the level of the ground. What's a water table? Well, in order to demonstrate this concept, I built myself this high-tech instrument called, ta-da, the water table. What is a water table? Well, it's really a simple concept. Any 10-year-old kid who's ever been down to the river fishing can understand it. About the only people who can't seem to figure it out are government resource managers and logging company employees. That's why I built my own. The water table is a concept. It's part of a branch of science called hydrology. And you can actually make your own little water table, demonstrate it just by pouring some water into a jar of sand. Or if I had a bottle of that disgusting, abysmal Yankee beer that they stole the name from another beer, I would use that for the demonstration, but I would never use Czech bar, so I'll use water for the demonstration. So here's dry sand. I pour some water in, it soaks down into the sand. It's still soaking in back here, so it's still going to keep sinking until it fills up all those spaces. And so you can see it's filled up all the spaces, and there's a line here. Below this line all the spaces are filled. If you put another molecule of water in there, it's going to push the water table up. If I put more water in it, water table is going to go up. If I take water out of there, if I dry it out, the water table is going to go down. So you can see the water table in a beaker of sand and water. And you can see the same idea across a watershed. The place where the water table is above the surface is called a river. And if you have less water or more gravel in that valley, the river gets shallow, or else it goes dry. So here's my water table. You can tell it's a water table because it says so. What I'm going to do is, I've got a bucket of sand and I've got a bucket of gravel. I'm going to set the water table up inside the mighty bullshit. My theory is that if I tilt up and down on the mighty bullshit, it will be like tectonic motion of the earth, right? It would be like what's happened on Vancouver Island. The land gets pushed and tilts up and everything is on an angle. And I can test out my theories about the water table and hydrology right here inside the mighty bullshit. So you can see that I've got the water table set up inside the boat here. I put a sheet of plastic in and I put some slanted sides in to mimic the sides of a valley, the mountain sides, and I put some plastic in to mimic the impervious layer of bedrock. So there's your water table. It's just a natural flowing stream going from this lake down through this little river and down into here right now. So that's how a water table operates. So cheers. Here's my water table. You can see my Cubs hat. Just for a tip, I'm kind of busy right now too, in addition to my filming duties. I don't know if I ever mentioned this on the Basstravaganza, but I'm also the assistant general manager, well, they call it VAGM, volunteer assistant general manager of the Chicago Cubs baseball team. And I'll actually turn the game on the computer sometimes and give them advice, like send a runner or put in a new pitcher or something like that. So I send them, I help them out by cosmic brainwaves, basically. Sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't. But anyway, there's Cubs game going on the computer right now, so can't talk too long. I have to run back and check on things. They're comfortably ahead. And I would like to point out that, not taking all the credit for it, of course, players are playing well, but since, again, I've agreed to be the VAGM this year, the Cubs do have the best record in all of baseball. Not that I'm taking all the credit for it, but they are in first place. So, my water table. The water table is actually a scientific term. And you can see this sand is all wet. There's enough water in here, it's going to fill up that depression, right? Yeah. So now you can see the water table. Scientific term for the water table is right here. It's the level below this level. All of this sand is saturated. There's no more room for any more water. The more water you put in, the more it's going to fill up and create a lake or a pond, whatever. But this is the water table inside my water table. And if I tilt this boat, it'd be like Vancouver Island under tectonic forces, right? The land, chunks of land are smashing together and they get crushed and tilted. If I tilt this whole water table, it's going to want to run out this end, right? So let's see what happens. So you can see the water table right there. That's where there's standing water. You can see the water table in this bottle of Czechvar. There's the water table. Above that, it is dry. Below that, it's saturated. No more room for any more. That's the beer table right there. This is the water table. Now this is on flat ground here, and I'm going to tilt this trailer, and if I tilt it, it's going to make it like plate tectonics, right? Like Vancouver Island, all the rocks are jammed and tilted, and it's going to cause a flow in this little watershed here. So let's see what happens. So you can see that I've tilted the boat here, and I've tilted my little watershed. While this was going on, I had to
I could sense these things by mental telepathy. I could tell the Cubs were in trouble, and I had to go. Their pitcher was losing control. I had to go put in a relief pitcher.
Back under control. The Cubs are ahead like 7-2 in the 9th inning anyway. But back to my little watershed. So now, if I pour some water in here, let's see what happens. So I'm going to use water to demonstrate our little watershed here. Not Czechvar, because this is Canada, not Czech Republic. So let's pour some water down our little watershed. You can see it likes to erode and wash that stuff away, right? The more you pour, the more it wants to erode. It's very wide and shallow as it's washing all that sediment downstream. Splits into 2 channels. Look at it just washing all that sediment away. It's very wide, very shallow. Can't get deep. As soon as it tries to get deep, it washes more sediment in and fills up with sediment. So this is the place where our little lake was before. Start pouring up here. You see what it happens? It's eroding some of that stuff, right? Washing all the erosion over this flood path here, and it's just trying to wash all this stuff down. Building up big shifting gravel bars here and cutting away. So that's your basic logged off Vancouver Island River. So in the days of yore, there would have been gigantic trees growing in along our watersheds on Vancouver Island. No more, because they're cut down and the stumps washed out. So to mimic that, I'm trying to take in these, they're thistle plant actually, that giant, it's called a cardoon. It's an invasive plant. So take one of these cardoon flowers and put some glue on it. And push it around in this dry sand. And these are going to be these are going to mimic my old growth tree stumps in my little hydrology experiment here. And of course this is a poor substitute for the real thing in the real world. There's giant cedar trees that are not only rooted into the ground, but their roots are intertwined with the roots of other giant cedar trees. And so I got delayed a little bit. I had to go take care of a little situation with the Cubs, but all's well that ends well, and they won their game, so I can get back to work. So you see what I've done here. I've got these artificial tree trunks, and let's see what happens when I run some water past them. Look how it scours out along there, but it leaves the tree trunks in place. So, what if we take this very same little miniature watershed, and instead of just putting big trees and tree roots on one side of the river, we put them on both sides. Look how deep and narrow this channel is. It stays between the roots of those giant trees, and it gets really deep and it's really narrow. And that's the reason our streams on Vancouver Island are ruined, and that's why we don't have any wild fish anymore. It's very simple. So, rainwater or snowmelt soaks into the ground, and it saturates the lower levels. And those lower saturated levels, the boundary between the lower saturated soil and the drier upper levels of soil, is called the water table. And across a landscape, there are places where the water table rises above the level of the gravel and the soil. If that's in a bowl-shaped area, we call it a pond or a lake. If it's in a sloping area like this, we call it a river. And when it rains or when snow melts, the water table goes up. And also, if it's in a river, also the amount of sediment that is carried in the current goes up, and maybe the amount of wood too. Look around me here, people. And when the glaciers were melting away on Vancouver Island 10,000 years ago, there were no trees here. There were massive amounts of erosion washing down mud, sand, gravel, rocks, and boulders. And this material was pushed out in floods that created wide, shallow stream channels. And they call them braided streams because they're no defined channel. They're just a bunch of little channels washing over all the sediment. And you can see this situation in many places today where glaciers are melting. So braided streams occur in places where floods are pushing huge loads of sediment down valleys, and there's nothing in the channel big enough to stand in their way. Braided streams are very shallow with little or no deep water. You can see that if the flow rises only a little bit, the whole area is going to go underwater. If the flow goes down only a little bit, the whole area is going to go dry. So that's what rivers were like here on Vancouver Island before trees came around, before the forests covered the valley and the streams were confined and squashed between the roots of these gigantic trees. And this is what the rivers of Vancouver Island are returning to after a century or more of ruthless clear cutting. So my focus is on reversing this process and forcing the rivers to become narrower and deeper again, like they used to be back in the days when they were confined between galleries of gigantic trees, and back in the days when they were loaded with huge wild fish. And I was hoping to go into more detail about my crazy ideas in this episode, but I got carried away with BSing again, and that's going to have to wait for the next episode. So our rivers here on Van Isle are in rough shape, but I want to, in closing this episode, I want to point out that it could be worse. It could be much worse. If what you see on the TV news is correct, huge areas of California and Oregon and Washington are burning right now, right down to charcoal as I speak. And in Bear Creek, where I used to live, they're burning down businesses and homes of people I used to know. All of it going up in flames in the middle of a deadly disease epidemic. So I want to give a shout out to the folks down there in Bear Creek and all the people down there who are struggling to save their homes and their lives and their watersheds. And I want to remind people how lucky we are to be living here right now on this beautiful island. Every sunset is more gorgeous than the last. So I'm hoping that soon it will be time to talk about rebuilding homes and lives and civilizations and rivers too. And that's what the next episode is going to be about. You can see all this wood around me here. You can see all this wood around me here. Where did it come from? How did it get here? What's it doing here? We'll discuss that on the next episode of the Basstravaganza.